Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I think this is something like our 18th or 20th Salt Live. We've been running this for a number of years now, and to be honest, it's one of my favorite things we do in the life of our church, because what we're trying to do with this whole Salt project is engage with the big questions of our culture and say, what does the Christian faith have to say to the most fundamental questions that are facing our culture, our society? And in fact, that's why we're looking at this question tonight, screen fatigue, how to be human in the digital age. Because over the years, we've dealt with a number of topics at these Salt Live events, and you can go back to our website, salt.london, you can get all of them online, they're recorded. But we've dealt with a number of topics which have had technology at the heart of them. We never looked at this topic specifically, but we've seen a number of different cultural questions which have had at their heart technology as a driver of change. So, for example, in 2016, I don't imagine many of you were here because London is, lots of people are coming and going, but in 2016 we did a Salt Live event, Is Truth Dead and Does It Matter? Is Truth Dead and Does It Matter? And at the time it was kind of Trump was on the horizon as the first heading towards his election. And we were asking, what is our grip on truth as a culture? And it seemed like we were seeing, the speaker that evening, provoked us to see that the way that social media brings a proliferation of different voices into the cultural sphere loosens our collective grip on the truth. Later on in 2018, a couple of years after that Salt Live, some academics from MIT University analyzed 4.5 million tweets across the previous decade, and they found that falsehood was 70% more likely to be shared than truth. So falsehood was 70% more likely to be shared than truth. And it seems, not just from the Salt Live event, but from various bits of research that have come since then, that phones, social media, the web seems to have blunted our collective power of discernment. So we look at truth, and then fast forward a few more years to 2023, and maybe some of you are here when we looked at a Salt Live event on the burnout generation. We looked at the idea that there were many people in our culture who feel weary and exhausted. That is the pervasive feeling that many people will experience. If you're a Londoner, you're going to speak to another Londoner and say, how are you doing? The first thing, I'm tired, I'm busy. That's very common. And one of the things we looked at when I immersed myself in that topic was the way that technology was a kind of enabler, that it had facilitated that experience of weariness and burnout. It promised us kind of hyper-productivity, the ability to work at all times from all places, but with it had led to an experience of weariness and burnout. And we'll return to that topic this evening. And then just around this time last year, in early 2024, we looked at another Salt Live event called The Age of Self-Obsession. The Age of Self-Obsession. And really what we were looking at there was the way that the modern era seems to could be described as the age of the self. Now, part of that is just a reflection of the fact that we've raised a generation on a steady diet of affirmation and praise. Really as a way of combating the danger of low self-esteem and all sorts of self-talk, saying like raising children, saying you are special, you can be anything you want to be. And it sounds kind of intuitively compelling, but actually it raised a generation of young people who actually often felt insecure and were turned in on themselves, constantly obsessed with themselves. And part of that was the ideology, but part of that was technology. That social media created a platform for young people to express themselves and to seek the validation of the crowd. And as such, they became focused on what other people say about them. They became insecure and addicted to approval. And so what I'm trying to show you is, and my thinking of why I wanted to do this evening's talk on technology was saying that technology is at the center of so much change that we observe in culture. Even beyond those three themes of an increasing sense of self-obsession, or the weariness and the burnout, or our grip on truth, there are all sorts of other ways that we would say technology is at the center of the change that we are witnessing in our society. So that's why I wanted to do this topic. But I wonder why you're here. I wonder why you made the choice. Many of you have never been to one of these events before. Why did you come to an event entitled Screen Fatigue, How to Be Human in the Digital Age? I suspect that for many of you in the room, the reason why you're here is you share with me some sense of nagging concern that the way we are engaging with technology in our society, in our culture, is not leading to human flourishing. I suspect that would unite many folk in this room. And actually what's really interesting is we've seen something of a real change in the way our culture has perceived technology. So some of you are not old enough to know this, but back in 2010, 2008, there was a real culture of techno-optimism. The sense that technology was going to change the way we function as humanity, as a society, and would bring all sorts of positive dividends. In 2010, Pew Research asked a question. They asked 400 prominent thinkers, essentially, what was their view on technology, and 80% of them were convinced that people's use of the internet will have enhanced human intelligence as people are allowed unprecedented access to more information, they become smarter and make better choices. That is what we expected in 2010. And now today, I think the mood music in our culture is very different. Let me give you two words that sum up what I think we see in our culture. Does anyone know what the 2024 Oxford English Dictionary word of the year was? Brain rot. Brain rot. The general sense that infinite scrolling will make us less intelligent. I think I've got that right. It's brain rot, not screen rot. I'm looking at my cultural zeitgeist man at the back who was telling me that just a couple of weeks ago. Another word that I think summarizes this, a word that kind of entered into our language of understanding, digital overwhelm. The sense of being overwhelmed by all these different alerts that create a sense of overwhelm and anxiety. The fact that we're coming up with these words, brain rot, from infinite scrolling, digital overwhelm, it captures something of the mood music that's going on in our culture as we see more and more articles about the dangers of technology. And of course, part of that fear is because we are going through a moment of technological change at a dizzying pace. The level, what we call adoption curves, the way that technology is changing so rapidly. It was only in late 2022 when ChatGPT came out into the world. It was launched by OpenAI, and since then, many of us, it's changed our working patterns. Many of us have used it. Many of us use it all the time now. But with that kind of adoption, comes a kind of fear. Like, what's this going to mean for the way we work and the way we interact and for the future of our jobs? But I would suggest you know this even at a personal level. You see, we talk all about the way that we perceive this in our culture, but I think many of us know that, particularly those of us who've been around for a while, when we think about the way this technology seems to have had an impact on us as individuals, we feel like technology is changing us. There's a writer, Samuel James, who's a Christian blogger and writer, and he kind of gave this sentiment that expresses something of the change. And I wonder if you would relate to what he says. He said, even we ourselves are somewhat different because of all these screens and pixels. Our eye strain headaches tell us something is different. Our desire to binge watch tells us something is different. Our sense of anxiety, loneliness, and isolation after a marathon of giving and receiving likes tells us something is different. I wonder if you can relate. Do you read less books than you used to? Do you find yourself with an inability to think as deeply as you used to? Perhaps an inability just to concentrate and to apply a kind of sustained focus to one subject for as long as you used to? Or do you find yourself constantly barraged by alerts and disruptions that undermine your ability to think? So, in preparation for this talk, I immersed myself in all the kind of literature of the writers, of the different people who'd sought to try and understand this major change. And I came really to a resounding conclusion that I want to bring to you now, which is technology isn't working for us. That it's much worse than we thought it was. It's worse than you think. And the reason I think this is interesting is because if we're honest, I think it's difficult for us to see this. Because we are immersed in this digital technology, that it's all around us, always available in our pockets, and ever present in our daily lives, it's hard for us to see the way this is shaping us. A writer, David Foster Wallace, tells a story entitled, he gave a talk called "This is Water." And he gives a little illustration in that. And he tells the story of two young fish swimming in the ocean. And an older fish swims up to them and says, "Hello, boys, how's the water?" And the younger fish respond, "What is water?" And the point of him telling that story is, he says, the most obvious important realities are often the hardest to see and talk about. When something's really right in front of your nose, it's very hard to see. Our lives are immersed in what's sometimes described as the social internet. It's very difficult to step back and analyze this neutrally. For most of us, over 50% of our waking hours are looking at a screen. Most of you probably spend between 4 and 6 hours looking at your smartphone. And you might think, well, that's not that significant. It was a time gone, not probably a couple of decades ago, where people would watch 4 hours of TV a day. But the difference is that smartphone usage is interspersed throughout the day. So it's not 4 hours in a block, it's basically perpetually always connected to the social internet. 46% of teenagers describe themselves as online almost constantly. And I suspect for many adults, many of us, we would say the same. And I think part of the reason why, if we're honest, why we don't engage with this, I think there's something uncomfortable about this. There's something uncomfortable about having to acknowledge that we are in thrall to the machine and even to acknowledge how much it's shaping our lives, how much of an impact it might be having on our loved ones. In 2020, one survey found that 68% of parents would describe themselves as sometimes or often distracted by their phones when spending time with their children. They're in this frustrating situation where they acknowledge the danger, and yet the majority of them would say, I kind of can't stop looking at it. It's getting in the way of my relationship with my children. We're raising a generation to believe that the screen is more important than they are. Counter the other way around. This is a survey from 2014, and I suspect it's got a lot worse in the last near decade or over a decade. 62% of children in this survey in 2014 felt like their parents were too distracted to listen to them. This technology is getting in the way of the most precious, intimate relationships we have. And one of the reasons why this is so difficult to acknowledge is because resistance is very difficult. To resist this, the effect of digital technology in our lives is almost impossible. Well, for one reason, the habits are very sticky. Anyone who's tried to put blocks on their phone and do all sorts of different things and screen time and all sorts of different ways of blocking this will know that there's always a way around them. It's very difficult to manage yourself in this area. And another reason why this is very difficult is because of what we call network effects. It might be possible for me to withdraw from all these networks, but then all my friends will demand my presence in their life, and they will want to use that same network to access me. So it's very difficult. That's why even you think about this in schools, that often one parent might say, okay, I can see the danger that's happening to my child, but their child cannot resist the idea of being on these social networks because they say, I could not possibly live if I wasn't present online like all my friends. And to be honest, the easiest thing in the face of the challenge of resisting this is it's easier to accept the impact, to say, well, this is just part of living in the 21st century, and to deny there's really a problem. The problem is the mental effects are clear. The mental health effects of this are clear that it's not good for us. A man called Jonathan Haidt, who's a secular psychologist who based at NYU University, wrote a book called The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And in it, he describes this period in history, in recent history, between 2010 and 2015, where smartphone adoption became ubiquitous, particularly among teenagers. I think probably it was already kind of mainstream sort of for adults by that point, but between 2010 and 2015, smartphones went from a minority of teenagers to basically the vast, vast majority of young adults and teenagers by 2015 had smartphones. And then he looks at all sorts of other indicators of mental health, of emotional well-being, and looks at how those changed over time during this period of great technological adoption. And what he finds is a number of different statistics that correlate exactly and precisely with this adoption of smartphone technology in all the wrong ways. He looks at how depression skyrocketed. In that period between 2010, major depression in girls went up 145%. So it went from about 1 in 10 before smartphones were around, 1 in 10 teenage girls in the US experienced major depression, to by 2023, that number had become 1 in 3. From 1 in 10 to 1 in 3. In boys, there was a similar increase, but they were starting from a lower base. We saw a great increase in anxiety across young adults, across teenagers, young adults. In undergraduate students, anxiety was about 2.5 times greater. Went from about 1 in 10 to 1 in 4. Suicide rates for boys nearly doubled, and for girls more than doubled between the period of 2008 to 2023. Now, I know what you're thinking. When you hear all these statistics, you think anxiety, depression, suicide. You think maybe the world is just a bit more anxiety-inducing, a bit more dangerous, a bit more, there's the climate anxiety, for example. Well, Jonathan Haidt, interestingly, responds to that critique in his book and says, well, in one sense, every generation has faced all sorts of negative catastrophes. Think about in the 60s and 70s, people were growing up with a prospect of nuclear annihilation. And before that, the World Wars and Great Depression in the 1930s. What he says is different is that the news of all the risks facing humanity are being pumped into young adolescents and young people's minds through the power of social media. That is what's changed. It's not that the world is scarier, it's that we are being confronted with all the things that would make us fearful all the time through that little screen. And the thing you really end up reading, I would encourage you to read, all of you to read this book. The thing you end up thinking as you read this book is it's not just children. It's fascinating. It's almost like Jonathan Haidt needed permission to talk about children because it's kind of a bit inappropriate to tell adults how to make life choices. And yet you end up reading it and think, well, surely the same is true for adults as well. Yes, perhaps young people have less developed prefrontal cortexes, so they're less able to control and focus on the thing they need to, and they're more susceptible to alerts and disruptions. But I think we see the same effects. He tells the story of one young woman, Emily, who's a 14-year-old, and her phone causes great tension between her and her parents. And she even, at one point, says, "I'll commit suicide if you put restrictions on my phone," to her parents. And it's awful, right? And then her parents send her on a 6-week summer camp where there's no technology. And when she comes back, they say she's a radically different young woman. They kind of say, "This is our old Emily back." But what I thought was fascinating when you read the story is, and then she got back into her phone, and they said they saw the same agitation and glumness. And as I read those words, I thought, I've seen that same reaction in myself. When I've spent a day scrolling on, or a day responding to messages, a day infused with WhatsApp, probably I end the day feeling a little bit agitated, a little bit kind of almost overwrought and anxious, just from the volume of alerts and messages that have been streaming into my life. Or if I spend a day kind of scrolling and just looking at different videos and news or things like that, well, you probably feel a bit blah. That's the best way I can describe it. A bit gloomy, a bit kind of nothing. It's not just Emily, not just 14-year-old Emily. It's 37-year-old, that's tomorrow, my birthday's tomorrow, 36-year-old Jeremy. See, even the social media companies have admitted this. We exposed this from, there was an expose in NPR in the US, a US media outlet, which was covering the news how some state officials from Kentucky were taking TikTok to court. And in it, they uncovered internal TikTok documentation. And according to TikTok's own research, compulsive usage correlates with a slew of mental health effects like the loss of analytical skill, memory formation, contextual thinking, conversational depth and empathy, and increased anxiety. Even TikTok to themselves will admit the effects. Let's go one more before we start talking about solutions. Sorry, I know it feels like a bit of a downer. But also, not just mental health effects here, we have to also see that perhaps the internet is making us less intelligent. Now, I know that sounds ironic. Often you think, well, I've got access to all this information, and surely this makes me more intelligent. Well, there's a man called Nicholas Carr. And he was a technology journalist, right? So he loved tech. He'd spent his life immersed in tech. He describes in his book, it's called Drowning in the Shallows, how in 1986 he received an Apple I device. And he describes opening it up and falling in love with this thing. So he's no Luddite, but interestingly, he writes a book in 2010, so way before the rest of us got pessimistic about technology. And in it, he describes how an increasing concern that the internet was constantly distracting him and ultimately retraining his brain to be less focused and deep thinking. And he said this is the summary of his argument, really. When the brain is overloaded by stimuli, as it usually is when we're peering into a network-connected computer screen, attention splinters, thinking becomes superficial, and memory suffers. We become less effective and more impulsive. Far from enhancing human intelligence, I argue the internet degrades it. Isn't that fascinating? And in his book, he comes up with all sorts of studies where he talks about the way that just the presence of your phone on your desk or near you as you're working reduces your ability to concentrate. They've done tests where, you're basically the measure of your working intelligence in that moment is lower. Similarly, if you put a phone in an interaction between two human beings and it's just present there, scores around empathy and the level of relational connection are lower. So it undermines both kind of ability to think and even the ability to relate to others. But really what he's talking about is how we're losing the art of deep contemplation and the ability to really think amongst a steady stream of digital distractions. And there's a fascinating story. It's almost like we're living in a dystopian future that was envisaged by our ancestors. There was a man called Kurt Vonnegut who wrote a short story in 1961 called Harrison Bergeson. And in this short story, he envisages an era when equality is enforced, where in America, they say everyone must be equal. So what do? Well, there are some people with higher IQ. So in order to reduce the IQ of the people who've got the highest IQ, we're going to put a machine on their head that is going to buzz every 20 seconds. And that buzzing is going to kind of buzz loudly for every 20 seconds. And that is designed to interrupt sustained thinking and to bring them down to average intelligence. Well, it sort of describes the 21st century, doesn't it? Except it's not just the intelligent people who got it. Everybody got it. Everyone got one of these machines in their pocket that was alerting them. The average one of us receives 192 alerts from all our social and communication apps. And that undermines our ability to think deeply. Another way of putting it is, say you're really trying to focus on something. It's a little bit like those alerts that come to you. One writer put it as they are like a Las Vegas-style sign calling out to you while you try to do almost anything else that says, tap here and I'll tell you what someone just said about you. Tap here and I'll tell you what someone else feels about you. As you're trying to do anything else, the minute that gets hard, how easy it is to say, okay, well, I'm just going to stop doing what I'm doing and just going to go see what other people are saying about me or what they're saying to me. And how easily that distracts us and stops us from being able to focus. So, I think that's the challenge we're facing as a culture. And the next question we have to ask is, why is this problem so persistent? And what I mean by this is fascinating, is as you read, you immerse yourself in the different writers in this literature, all the people writing about this are still struggling with the problem themselves. I felt this myself as I was writing and reading, and I was writing and reading and preparing, and then I'd go down a digital wormhole and I'd be chastising myself saying, you're being addicted just like what you're talking about. It was like a meta experience of the same problem that I was writing about and reading about. Jonathan Haidt, the writer I mentioned, describes himself as a fellow human being who has felt overwhelmed personally and perpetually since around 2014. Nicholas Carr, the guy I mentioned who had this book in 2010, I would listen to a podcast by him in 2024, 14 years later. And in the podcast, he's being asked about his own personal digital habits and says, I'm still struggling. 14 years after he wrote the book telling everyone there's a problem. Why is this problem so persistent? And it's so easy to assume it's manipulative algorithms and to blame the social media companies. But what we have to see is the reason why this technology is so persistent, the habits are so persistent, is because the technology superficially connects with our deepest needs and longings as human beings. The reason why many of us find it impossible to shake these digital habits is because it superficially connects with our deepest intrinsic needs and desires. Let me give you a few. Productivity. We turn to these apps and technologies because we're drawn towards digital innovation because technology promises the ability to multiply our productivity, to multiply our impact on the world, to even, in one sense, at the very broadest sense, technology promises for us to the power over nature and over the world that we're based in. So of course we're drawn towards these apps because they promise productivity, and with productivity, probably increased wealth. Or connection. We are drawn towards social media. Why? Because it offers connection with other human beings. Or satisfaction. We all want satisfaction, don't we? Wake up in the morning saying, I want to be satisfied. The reason why we turn to these apps and technologies is because they promise us instant gratification. Whether it's Deliveroo or instant shopping on Amazon or online pornography, whether it's sexual gratification in that sense, we are constantly being drawn to these things because they are saying, come here and be gratified. Or validation. The reason why we're drawn towards social media is because we want to be told that we are valuable. Every human being wants that. Everybody wants to feel that they're valuable, don't they? And so with the number of likes or responses or ticks or whatever it is, those things signify a sense of validation and acceptance. It speaks to the longing of the human heart. Or peace. We are so often full of discontent and angst, and so often we turn to the apps and the scrolling as a way of kind of distracting ourselves, of finding some kind of superficial peace, of dealing with the angst in our soul. Well, I just don't want to have to deal with that, so I'm just going to scroll. That is what's going on. Or even awe. I would argue that every human being is wired with a need for awe and worship. And so often, as we marvel at modern technology, I mean, I don't know if you've spoken to, and I was speaking to an AI engineer just this last week, and he was talking about it saying, it's magic, almost. And there's a sense to which when we marvel at technology, it connects with our desire, our sense of awe and wonder. We want to experience awe, and so often technology sort of seems to connect with that longing in our hearts. We must see that behind our digital, I would say, addictions is not just clever engineering, it's technology that's been constructed to meet our deepest needs and longings. That's what anybody's doing when they're putting together an app. They're saying, how can we make this as powerful as possible? Well, what do people want? And let me connect to that. It's not surprising. And yet, I would argue it's not working because it's doing it in an inhuman way. And this is where I must declare an interest. What I mean by that is, I am not neutral. I'm a pastor. I come from a Jewish atheist family, but I became a Christian at the age of 20. And I became convinced that Jesus Christ was no mere wandering Jewish teacher, but was God in the flesh, who he claimed to be. And I was convinced that human beings will find flourishing as they connect with him, they worship him, and they have a relationship with him, and they live according to his wisdom, his teaching for life. And so, because the reason I state that now is because the question I wanted to answer tonight was how to be human in the digital age. Well, to answer that question, you have to kind of say, well, what does it mean to be human, don't you? And I'm saying, well, I have a vision of what it means to be human. And you may not share that vision. I realize that there'll be many people in the room who are not Christians, coming from a secular perspective, I suspect. But what I want to do is unpick something of the underlying logic of the technology that we are engaging with. Because just as I'm not neutral, the technology is not neutral. It was written according to a certain worldview and logic. And I want to unpick the kind of messages or worldview that technology is built according to, and I want to compare it against the Christian vision for life. And it is my conviction, as I do that for you, you may not share my Christian convictions, that you would see that the Christian vision of life makes sense of our deepest instincts. That actually it provides a better story, so to speak, a better vision for life than the vision that you experience from technology. That doesn't make it true, by the way. It doesn't make it true. You still have to then go and look and investigate and say, is Jesus who he said he was? Was he just some wandering Galilean who chanced upon some truth that would change the world? Or was he God in the flesh? That question is a historical question, fundamentally. But you must first of all consider whether it's even worth you doing that. It's my conviction that when you see the beauty of the Christian vision for life, particularly in comparison with the really rather unbeautiful vision for life that is underlying some of the technology that we're engaging with, you will see something of the beauty of the Christian story and be prompted perhaps even to look further. Because I want to show you that this 30-year experiment that we're experiencing now with hyper-connected digital technology and social media is no match for the ancient wisdom found in Christian teaching. It's my conviction that the Christian wisdom connects more deeply with your instincts and gives a better story for humanity. Let me look at a few things then. Productivity. Christian teaching calls for limits, not burnout. Digital technology promises hyper-productivity, but leads to perpetual multitasking and potentially burnout. Christian wisdom says the opposite, says actually accept your limits, enjoy rest, and actually you are more than your work. And that is liberating. It's almost like as you just hear that, you can sigh a sense of relief when you understand what the Christian story says. See, digital technology draws us in with a promise of increased productivity. Download this app and increase your efficiency by X%. Use ChatGPT and get rid of all these mundane tasks and get the machine to do it for you. There's an irony, of course, though, that as we've taken all these technical innovations that promised greater productivity, it hasn't led to more rest and more leisure. The opposite is true, isn't it? As we've taken on all these technologies, we've ended up being wearier and closer to burnout. Why? Because we live in a state of perpetual multitasking. I think the screen is part of the reason for that. Whether it's checking email in a meeting, or doing a call whilst working out in the gym, or sending email on the toilet. Don't admit to it now, but I'm sure some of you do it. Catching up on messages while watching TV. Why? Why is multitasking so much part of our culture? Well, it's because we've believed the myth that technology has told us when it said to us, you can transcend your limits as a human being. This is what one writer, Walter Brueggemann, said about multitasking. It is the drive to be more than we are, to control more than we do, to extend our power and our effectiveness. And such practice yields a divided self with full attention given to nothing. What I'm arguing is that multitasking is emblematic of the way we try to harness technology to overcome the natural limits of being human. Daniel said I coach different startup leaders, and I spent 5 years working for a tech startup. It was a wonderful experience. I loved it, and it means I'm not a Luddite. I believe in technology to change the world myself. But yet I so often saw, both in the previous incarnation and now, that there's so many young people whose lives are perpetually consumed by a busyness and an attempt to try and squeeze the productivity out of life and to maximize their impact on the world. And quite frankly, it's exhausting. And the Christian message says, no, you don't have to live like that. The Christian wisdom says, actually, you're not God. You're just a human being who has limits. And actually, that sounds defeatist, but it's actually freeing. It means I can sleep at night knowing that I'm not in control of the universe, and I'm not trying to be in control of the universe. I'm just trying to do my part in my little field that God has given me, in my life, in whatever responsibilities that He has given me. And actually, I can put my head on the pillow at night knowing that He's in control. The reason why we live in a hyper-productive age is because we've removed God. And so we try to be God and overcome these natural limits that exist. Psalm 127 in the Bible says, "It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for He gives to His beloved sleep." That is the anxious toil is the mantra of our culture. It's what we observe all around us because our culture has forgotten the verse that preceded that. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. Basically, your efforts are nothing compared to the living God. And so you can rest tonight and go to sleep. I lead a church of a few hundred people. I'm one of the leaders here. It would be easy for me to fret over all the different concerns and issues going on in people's lives. But I can put my head on the pillow at night, and trust the Lord with the church that he's given me to pastor, because I'm not him, I'm not God, I'm just a man. I accept my limits. And because I'm not God, I can rest. The gift of rest is there if you're a Christian because you believe that God has given you the gift of rest. Right there from the beginning, the framework for life that God has established for human beings, the 10 commandments, the 4th commandment, you should have a Sabbath rest. What does Sabbath mean? It means a day where you can cease from work. You can connect with God. You can celebrate, enjoy the good gifts that he's given. And that invitation to rest comes from the fact that you are not God. You don't need to try and control the universe. You can even enjoy a day of rest. And also, the reason why you can rest, the reason why you're not drawn towards a kind of technology-induced hyperproductivity is because you are more than your work. You are more than just a productivity machine. According to the Christian faith, work was a gift given to us by God. Work is a gift to us, and we enjoy it. It's part of our design that we were made to work. But before we were given work, we were made for a relationship with God. And what that says is human beings, before they work, they are loved. Because the Christian faith, at the very heart of the Christian story, says every human being is loved by God. That he made them for a relationship with himself because he loves them. He made them to enjoy that relationship of love. And that relationship of love is more important than anything else in their life. And what that means, this is really important, you get this, you hear this, it means they can fail. Because even when they fail at their work, they are loved by God. I, again, coach lots of young people, lots of different leaders in business and in technology businesses, and I've watched the impact of failure on some people. And in a productive world, when you experience failure without God, you are crushed. Your life is over. If you heard those words, my work is my identity. So when I fail at my work, my life is over, effectively. But the Christian says, no, that doesn't need to be true. Because the Christian has a different story that says, at the root of who I am loved by God, and I'm made for a relationship with him. So I can lose my work, I can fail at it, I can get fired, and I'm still loved. It gives them the ability to fail because they are more than their work. So digital technology promises hyperproductivity, but leads to perpetual multitasking and burnout. Christian wisdom says you accept your limits, enjoy rest because you are more than your work. It's a radically different story. You see this in the area of connection. Social media or digital technology today promises connection but leads to individualism, isolation, and disconnection. Christianity says embrace embodied community and collective rhythms because you are never meant to do life on your own. Social media is powerful because it speaks to that intrinsic longing within each of us for connection. It's why we fail to disconnect with these platforms, why they speak so loudly to us, because they speak to the longing, in each one of us to be known and loved. And yet they achieve the very opposite of that because they fail to deliver the embodied physical connections that we're wired for. Jonathan Haidt, again, I mentioned he was a secular atheist writer from a Jewish background, but in his book, one of the chapters is he considers the way technology in our lives has run against ancient spiritual wisdom. And he particularly draws into this idea of embodied community. And he says, the online social network is no match for the experience of gathering together in a spiritual community. He says this, transient networks of disembodied users interacting asynchronously don't match embodied communities with a shared vision of life. Technology shapes us into considering ourselves as an individual user and an individual consumer. So every product manager begins the journey. What's the user journey? Let's take the individual user through this digital journey. But the Christian wisdom starts from a very, very different assumption. So actually you're not an individual placed in a world to try and figure out your own path. You're actually made for a relationship with God, as I said, but you're also made for a relationship with others. You are made to be part of community, an embodied, physical, gathered community. Think about how the Christian story begins, with Adam and Eve in a garden. And God says it's not good for Adam to be alone, so he gives Adam and Eve together. He gives them the gift of marriage, we'd say friendships, but really we'd also say community. Anyone who's been part of a church will tell you it can be frustrating at times, as different people speak into your lives or different people fail you in some way but it's also one of the most rich and powerful experiences to be thrust together with a group of people who, without your faith, you have perhaps very little in common. That's what we experience here at Grace. We've got folk from all sorts of different parts of the world coming together in a shared faith, in worshiping together, enjoying life together, meeting in homes together, eating food together. It kind of sounds unbelievable until you experience it. Until you see the way that faith in Christ unites this group of strangers together into something profoundly beautiful. Something that speaks profoundly to that longing for intimacy and connection with another human being. And quite frankly, the digital technology, social media connections that we have been lulled into thinking offer us connection are nothing compared to the physical embodied community that Christ calls us and draws us into. And really, what you've got to see is behind that community, it comes back to, remember what I said, human beings were made for a relationship with a God who loves them. And even in that community, we experience that love as we fail each other, as we let each other down, and yet we're continually drawn back into a community of love. It speaks of the love that we have experienced in our relationship with God. Just ponder this for a moment. Why do you have a longing for love in your heart? Why do you feel a longing for love? I suspect every one of you would say at the very depth of your being, you long to be loved. Why does that exist in you? I would suggest that it makes complete sense to understand that you were made by a God who loves you, who made you for a relationship with himself. That the very thing that explains that longing for love inside you is the Christian story, with at its center a God who made you because he loves you. So social media promises superficial connection. The Christianity calls you to an embodied community because you were never meant to do life on your own. Satisfaction. Social media, or digital technology says there is limitless instant gratification, but leaves you feeling dissatisfied. Christianity says you'll never be satisfied by instant gratification, the instant gratification machine of the internet, because you need to know the love of God to be truly satisfied. Isn't it fascinating that digital technology has opened up a world of instant gratification to us? It's given us all sorts of ways of gratifying our desires, and yet we still feel dissatisfied. We consume millions of pounds of delicious food at the touch of a button. We order all sorts of things to arrive in our home in the next 24 hours. Through online pornography, you could basically pay anyone around the world to perform any sex act you want. And yet, it's not enough. And yet, there's a longing inside us to feel like we still don't have enough. Even with everything that the internet has to offer, there's a longing for more in us, isn't there? That after a while, the Deliveroo tastes stale. The 30th Amazon parcel barely registers as you open up another thing and think, oh yeah, I ordered that a few weeks ago. And we look for more exciting ways of titillating the senses, looking for more and more. Why? Because we're dissatisfied. And the Christian wisdom says that's exactly what you'd expect. Because actually your desires are not even sometimes the best guide for what is best for you. The Christian faith says something which our culture doesn't. Our culture says, gratify every desire inside you and you will be satisfied. The Christian faith says, no, actually control your desires. But more than even just controlling your desires, the Christian faith says you are dissatisfied because the material things of this life will never satisfy you ultimately. And the reason that sense of dissatisfaction in our culture is a pointer to the fact that you are made for something more. The writer C.S. Lewis argues the presence of desires that cannot be met by this world points to a greater reality. He says creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger, well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desires, well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find myself with a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. You're dissatisfied because you're looking in the wrong place. Only God will ultimately satisfy you. Doesn't mean there aren't lots of things you can enjoy in this world as good gifts from God. But ultimately, the deepest source of satisfaction in the human existence is the love of God. The sense that you can fail, and even in your darkest moments, meet with your Father in heaven who loves you and accepts you is the love. That sense of love and mercy is the thing that speaks loudest to the longing for satisfaction in the human heart. The internet says, come here and experience instant gratification. Christianity says, come to God and you will find lasting satisfaction. Do one more and then we'll close. Validation. Human beings long for validation. Social media says, here's your platform, express yourself and chase the applause. And yet it leaves you feeling insecure and addicted to approval. Christianity says you are loved, so you do not need to live for the approval of man. See, social media is powerful and destructive for the same reason. It's powerful because it gives us a platform to represent ourselves, to present and curate an image of ourselves for the world to see and hopefully approve. It's powerful because you can be anyone you want to be, and you can invest thousands of hours and pounds in presenting an image of yourself to the world. But it's destructive because when we live our life on show, we quickly fall into the trap of living for the validation of others or succumb to the pattern of comparing ourselves with others. I believe that in the modern world of presenting this image of yourself to the world, there are thousands of people feeling insecure and wretched from constantly comparing themselves to others. There's even the story of Jessica Torres, who was a plus-sized fashion blogger who was preaching self-acceptance, and yet she said even her social media activity undermined the very message she was preaching. She says, the hundreds of dollars and time I spent on one Instagram photo felt like a waste. Nothing was perfect enough to post. Even though I was preaching self-love, I was doing the complete opposite with myself. I kept comparing my Insta page with other influencers whose images were prettier. I came to associate my self-worth with the amount of likes my images were getting. Christianity starts with the exact opposite dynamic of social media. Social media says present yourself and get acceptance from the crowd. Christianity says you are loved by God, so you don't need to worry about what everyone else thinks. You're free from living under the tyranny of the approval of man, of worrying and being controlled by the opinions of others. Because you know you're loved by God, because God describes himself as your Father, and you're as his son, therefore, drawn into the loving embrace of your Father. When you experience that love, you are freed and liberated from being controlled by the opinions of others. And that is true freedom. It liberates us from the tyranny and the slavery to the opinions of others that so many live in today. Just as social media offers distraction and scrolling, the Christian faith offers a deeper answer to the discontent within our souls. The writer Blaise Pascal said, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He wrote that in the 1600s, but it could equally be described as our model, as our situation today. Inability to sit in a room on my own alone. And he says the reason why that's a problem is because you distract yourself from the inner longing for God within every human heart. That we're constantly distracting ourselves away from the angst that's going on in our souls. Just as he said that in the 1600s, I think you could describe that with the culture that we're in today. That even the digital, social, tech universe that we are immersed in stops us from really considering the fundamental, deep questions of life. It stops us from really considering whether behind the screen there is a God who is calling out to us. Behind our angst and our discontent, perhaps there is a longing and a need for the God who made us. But we can't see it. We don't even give time to consider it because we're just scrolling ourselves to death. So as we close, I really want to ask you a question. Or maybe you would ask me a question. What do we do now? And yes, I would certainly encourage you to consider the limits on technology. Yes, digital Sabbaths once a week. Turn away your phones. I think you should get a box, put it in your hallway with a key and a padlock, and every week, at least once a week for a whole day, you should put it in that box and not get any digital devices out. Yes, put limits on your technology. Yes, build your self-control muscle. That's what I tell my 6-year-old son in all sorts of ways. And I would say that to us as adults, that the power to control your urges and desires will become the fundamental skill of the 21st century. In the face of all the competing digital demands that are being thrown at you, the ability to control your focus and to prioritize the right things in life will become the skill of the 21st century. So build that self-control muscle. But really, the answer I would give you ultimately to what we should do now is look up. The most fundamental problem in your life is not your technology usage, but your disconnection. Your disconnection from the God who loves you and intended you to live under his fatherly care. Psalm 23 captures what it feels like to know a God who loves you. You may have heard it. It talks. The first line is, "The Lord is my shepherd; I shall not want." The psalmist is speaking of a God who cares for them, who loves them, who leads them like a shepherd leads a sheep. I shall not want. I have everything I need because I have a God who cares for me. Instead, I think today in our culture, we live in exactly the opposite spirit. One writer flipped it on its head and said, what would be the opposite of that? He'd say, I'm on my own. No one looks after me or protects me. I experience a continual sense of need. Nothing's quite right. Isn't that the spirit of our age? I'm on my own. No one looks after me or protects me. I experience a continual sense of need. Nothing's quite right. This is the cry of thousands of millions, I would say, focused on the screen in front of them, but connected from the God who made them. Disconnected from the God who made them and disconnected from the people situated right next to them. So look up, look behind the screen at the God who put the breath in your lungs, who you owe your very existence to, and come and receive the love that you are made for. Or at least, at the very least, stop scrolling, stop distracting yourself from the discontent within your soul, and at least look up long enough to say, could this be true? Could this be true that there is a God who made me, who longs for me, who loves me, who intends to be the very center of my existence? What would it mean if this was true? I believe it would change everything if this was true. So at least would I encourage you or challenge you to stop distracting yourself from the most fundamental question that all of us must consider. Is there a God who loves me, who made me for relationship with himself, and who once I acknowledge that, changes everything?